Welcome to Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, an ongoing investigation into the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy on the campaign trail in June of 1968, and the trial of his convicted killer, Sirhan Sirhan. In the previous 10 episodes of this series, I presented to you, the listener, the case for the prosecution and the defense, including court documents, witness testimony, including Sirhan's own, in the courtroom, in his notebooks, and interviews he's given over the past 56 years. I've also brought you interviews with experts on the case, historians, journalists, and authors who represent both the conspiratorial view and also those who believe that Sirhan acted alone. Once you've finished this podcast series, you'll have all of the evidence you need to make up your own mind as to Sirhan's guilt or innocence, because you, the people, are the jury. On this episode, it's my pleasure to welcome back British author and historian Mel Ayton, whom I interviewed on episode 8 of this series, where we explored Sirhan's motive for the crime. And Mel is the author of The Forgotten Terrorist, Sirhan Sirhan and the Assassination of Robert Kennedy, originally published by Potomac Books in 2008. The updated 2019 edition features a foreword by Professor Alan Dershowitz. Mel also has a new book coming out later this year, which is the first ever real biography of RFK's convicted killer. It's titled The Making of an Assassin: Why Sirhan Sirhan Murdered Robert Kennedy. Mel Ayton makes the most compelling argument that I've ever heard for Sirhan's guilt and presents an airtight case for the prosecution. So as this series reaches its conclusion, I wanted to give Mel Ayton the closing argument. He says that Sirhan is right where he belongs, in prison for life. We are broadcasting this episode live on X Spaces so that Mel can take your questions towards the end. We're going to have a Q&A portion of the program and speak to the listeners all over the world. Mel is located in Durham, England, and joins us now. Welcome back, my friend. It's a pleasure to have you here again. How are you?
It's good to be back, Laurie. Yes, hello.
Well, maybe there's hope that minds can be changed with actual facts and evidence, and that's what started me on this journey. Mel, as you know, I used to believe that there was a conspiracy in the RFK murder case. I believed that for many years. Paul Schrade was a close personal friend of mine, and he convinced me.
And as I said, there was nothing wrong in that, Laurie, because you have to question your history, you have to question your government. But when you take it to the nth degree, and when these things are being looked at and you have rationality and logic involved, yes, it's different. So, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that at all.
Well, I think that as a journalist, and as a historian, it's
Correct.
My duty to report the truth and never to be wedded to one theory if I realize that I'm wrong. If I find better evidence and I realize I'm wrong. And that's how I started on this series like 7 months ago. The original idea for this series, Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, was just to examine Sirhan's 1969 trial, because we were coming up on the 55th anniversary. His trial ran for 4 months in the spring of 1969, from January through April. And I went back and I looked at files that I hadn't looked at in 35 years. I started on this journey back in 1988 when the LAPD files became public. And back then, I was convinced that Sirhan did it. Then a few years after that, I met Paul Schrade. And Paul Schrade was a very persuasive and persistent man, and he managed...
Decent guy as well. Dan Mulder says that, a very decent guy.
He was, rather. He's no longer with us, and I miss him, and he was a very good man. He convinced me. He convinced Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who also used to believe Sirhan was guilty until he met Paul Schrade and Lisa Pease, and sort of fell under the influence of Sirhan and his defense attorneys. And they changed his mind. Of course they would, because they're trying to get their client out of prison. And they'll blame anybody other than their client. And I think that's why they tried to focus him on Thanes Caesar. Like, if we can just blame this guy, then we can get our guy out of jail. But speaking of the trial, I want to get back to the trial a little bit here and talk about there was disagreement between his defense lawyers. He had his main lawyer, you had Grant Cooper, the lead attorney, and others on his defense team who wanted to go for what they called the diminished capacity defense, basically temporary insanity, because they knew they couldn't get him off you couldn't get him off the hook. 77 witnesses had seen this guy in the kitchen firing a gun, yelling, Kennedy, you son of a bitch, while he's shooting him. They knew they couldn't possibly get him off the murder rap. But one of his defense lawyers, because he also had some Arab lawyers who were on his team, and one of them, Abdin Jabara, who's a very prominent Arab civil rights attorney, he advised Sirhan not to make a plea deal because he wanted a public trial, believing that it would advance the Palestinian cause in the minds of the American public. The judge, Judge Walker, also believed that there had to be a trial because knowledge from that trial, the judge said, quote, might prevent future crimes of a similar nature. Unfortunately, though, it did.
Referring to the John Kennedy assassination, of course, where all of this, if you don't tie up loose ends, then it leads to all the speculation. Yeah.
And yes, it was that era, in the 60s of political assassinations coming one right after the other. You had JFK in 63 and then Malcolm X in, was it 64 or 65?
Malcolm X.
It was 64, wasn't it?
Malcolm X, 64 or 65.
Right.
February 65, I think. So you had, Malcolm X. And then, you had Lincoln Rockwell, the Nazi guy. Right. Then Martin Luther King, April 68. And then Bobby Kennedy. Yeah.
And Bobby Kennedy, it was like 2 months later to the day after Dr. King was killed. Right. And, unfortunately, this, in fact, was only the beginning of a new era of violence, political violence, where we had hijackings and hostage takings and bombings and murders. We started this whole new era of terrorism almost immediately after the assassination of RFK. I found it fascinating. There was just 1 month after the RFK assassination in July of 1968. That's when the hijacking era really began. You had this Israeli flight that was hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's an ordeal that lasted for like 39 days.
Yeah. Joe Kennedy on a plane in the Middle East and hijacked. So, that Bobby's son.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm just going to take our listeners who might not be familiar with this history. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to sort of walk you through some of these incidents and take you through the timeline so that you can really get a feel for it. There was that first hijacking in July of 1968, the Israeli flight. That lasted for 39 days. Those hostages were eventually released unharmed, thank goodness. Then came that spectacular September 1970 incident where that same terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also known as the PFLP, they hijacked. This is a lot like the precursor. I call it the blueprint for 9/11. They hijacked 4 passenger airliners. 3 of them were American flights headed for New York City. And they attempted to hijack a 5th plane, an Israeli airliner. But in that case, they did not succeed because a well-trained pilot and their crew, the pilot was a hero. He shot one of the hijackers. They took the others and subdued them, and they saved the lives of all the passengers and crew. It was reported at that time that the hijackers' ransom demands included the release of Sirhan Sirhan from prison. Now, the Sirhan's mother and some of his brothers held a press conference imploring the hijackers not to kill those innocent hostages in Sirhan's name. And indeed, the PFLP released the hostages unharmed. But They blew up those 4 empty aircraft on the runway in this big spectacular fireball to send a message to the world. And the message was, if you continue to support Israel, more of this will be coming your way. And this was not an empty threat. It was a promise. The following year, in 1971, Palestinian terrorists hijacked 2 passenger planes and threatened to fly them into nuclear power plants. Thank goodness that plot was foiled. A year after that was the horrific attack on the Olympic Games in Munich, where the PLO-associated group Black September took the Israeli team hostage, killed all 11 of them, plus a West German police officer who was attempting to rescue the hostages, and then 5 of the terrorists were killed in a shootout at the airport. And then a year after that, in 1972, a terrorist group called the Organization for Resisting Zionist Persecution, affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, hijacked a Lufthansa passenger jet bound from Greece because they knew that the son of Robert Kennedy would be on board that aircraft. That was RFK's eldest son, Joseph Kennedy, former congressman from Massachusetts. At the time, he was only 19 years old. He was taken hostage along with 172 passengers and 15 flight crew members. Those hijackers demanded $5 million ransom or said they would blow up the plane, killing all the souls on board. The plane was later diverted to Yemen, and Lufthansa, which was a company owned by the West German government, paid the ransom. They paid the $5 million, and all the hostages were released unharmed. But the Kennedy family's long nightmare still was not over. You know, I should point out that every time Palestinian terrorists hijacked an aircraft and took hostages, including RFK's son, every time they demanded Sirhan's release in exchange for hostages, they re-traumatized the Kennedy family over and over and over again. And this went on for years. And then in 1973, it happened yet again. In March of 1973, there was the Khartoum incident in Sudan, where the same group, Black September, burst into the embassy and took 10 hostages, including 3 American diplomats, and once again they demanded the release of Sirhan from prison. President Nixon said nope, he was not going to negotiate with terrorists, and this time they brutally tortured and murdered those hostages. Mel, I'd like for you to talk to me about why Sirhan is regarded as a hero, not just to Palestinians, but also to American communists and leftists such as the Weather Undergrounds, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. They dedicated their 1974 manifesto, Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism, to Sirhan Sirhan, and they hailed him as a courageous political prisoner. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, you know, the left tend to believe that political violence is an answer to injustices. I mean, we see that with guerrilla activities all around the world. The Castro Revolution, and you can go on and on and on. This is what the left's position is. But I think with this case, it's a lot more than that. It's the promulgation of anti-Semitism. And it seems to be really getting out of control at the moment, actually. But going back to, can we go back to 1968? What a lot of people didn't know, and what was ignored by the media, was that Al-Fatah, was the Palestinian group initially formed by Nasser, actually, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Al-Fatah was sending representatives to the United States to give speeches around America, colleges. Sirhan was pretty much fascinated with that. One student, when he was at Pasadena College, which he flunked, he was only there for about a year and a half. But one of his fellow students said he actually went to Los Angeles to observe the Shah of Iran, who was there at the time. I think that was early. I'm sorry, I can't remember the date. So Why is this happening? Yes, because that's the position they take, and a lot of it has to do with anti-Semitism.
Well, as a matter of fact, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that group is still alive and active today. They are,
That's right.
directly involved in the protests that we're seeing right now on American college campuses against the war in Gaza. So they're still around.
That's right. Well, also a lot of people sort of get confused. They think that, well, if you're against this or against it, it means that you're anti-Muslim. Well, it's not about being anti-Muslim, because the core of Sirhan's efforts was nationalism, not religion. In fact, he'd abandoned his Christian, and they always refer to him as a Christian, but he'd abandoned his Christian faith um, as a young man, a teenager, actually, when he was at college and all that. There are lots of people who make reference to the fact that he didn't believe in God. His last employer at the health store, John Widener, said that Sirhan used to rail about there's no God, and that he was an atheist. So why they keep doing this, I don't know. I mean, he now he carries a Bible and a Quran in his cell. I think he's hedging his bets there, but nothing to do with the religion. It was his nationalism. George Abash, of course, was the leader of the PFLP. He was a Christian, so you had a minority of Palestinians were Christians, still are, of course, in the West Bank. The majority Muslim. So for people to say that people are doing this because of their anti-Muslim um, feelings, well, it's just not true.
And Sirhan's defenders over the years, this is another whopper they tell, particularly some well-meaning California leftists like my late friend Paul Schrade, the RFK campaign worker who was shot by Sirhan that night, Lynn Magnon, and Lisa Pease, who wrote the book A Lie Too Big to Fail. They've attempted to paint him as a model prisoner, just a mild-mannered sweetheart of a guy who's not any threat to society. They say that he's not violent and that he should be set free, but that's not really true. I mean, there have been many incidents.
I reveal in my book, Laurie. Thank you for bringing it up. As I reveal in my book, there's plenty of instances of time in prison where he was, he showed a lot of anger and was involved in violence. Even at the parole boards, actually, his lawyers assigned model prisoner and all that. No, that simply isn't true.
I mean, there have been incidents over the past 5.5 decades where Sirhan threatened to kill prison guards. He had to be sedated with tear gas. Had to be put in solitary, got into violent altercations with other prisoners. He was stabbed multiple times and had his throat slashed just a few years back, I think in 2019. Is that right?
That's correct. He was attacked, yes. But as far back as the time of the trial, Robert Blair Kaiser wrote an excellent book, RFK Must Die, because he got an insight by being accepted to join the defense team. And he became a defense investigator with Michael McCown. Robert Blair Kaiser upset Sirhan, so Sirhan sent him a letter. There's a copy on Dan Mulder's site. It's the Hey Punk letter, and threatened to kill Robert Blair Kaiser just like he did with Bobby Kennedy.
He did. He threatened Kaiser's life. And, while we're talking about whoppers, over the years, Sirhan's story has changed as many times as you and I might change our socks. He confessed his guilt.
He's taken a two-track approach.
I mean, he's confessed his guilt to numerous journalists, including David Frost, Dan Mulder, and Paul Callan. Paul Callan had a particularly chilling experience with Sirhan in 1978. He wrote, and I'm just going to quote what he wrote here. Sirhan, quote, coiled his fingers, around an imaginary 22 caliber revolver and aimed it at my head. Paul Callan also remembered that as they parted, Sirhan quoted Nietzsche saying, quote, "One should guard against being spiritually disturbed after committing a great act." And Callan thought, a great act? The brutal murder of Robert Kennedy? Sirhan told him, "I was not regretful about killing a man who was threatening me, my life, my country, my Palestine, my beloved homeland. What I did," and he says, what I did was a political act. I was the instrument." And Sirhan explained his thinking on the night that he murdered Kennedy, and he indicated that although he often claimed not to remember the events of that evening, he did remember very clearly. And he said, quote, "I remember I was greatly agitated and in a highly nervous condition. Then I read in the Los Angeles Times that a Zionist organization," and Sirhan spat out the word Zionist, Callan said, "was planning to hold a victory march in the vicinity of the hotel where Kennedy was speaking. It was that march that compelled me to go downtown." He said, "My lovely Palestine was emotionally in my heart. Like most Arabs, I do not drink alcohol, so my body was not used to it. I remember returning unsteadily to my car to rest. I had to get my mind straight. I also had to go and get the gun because I was afraid the Jews would steal it." And it's also interesting that Sirhan left his driver's license in the glove compartment of the car before he went in to shoot Kennedy, which speaks to premeditation. When he was arrested, he refused to give the officers his name, and he was referred to in the early press reports after the shooting as John Doe until the next day when the police found his car and his identification, and then they told us who he was, gave us his name. So tell me a little more, Mel, about Sirhan's amnesia and memory lapses. Do you think any of it is real, or is it all just a big lie?
There's no doubt that he'd had at least 4 Tom Collinses by his own admission. So he had a bit of a drunken haze about him. But all his remarks, like you've just explained there, Laurie, go to the core of means, motive, and opportunity, as Dan Mulder, I think, called one of his articles, a subtitle of his book, I think. Means, motive, and opportunity. He's got to take away all of those. And you've just mentioned a few ways he did it. His defenders, too, keep on trying to take the motive away from Sirhan, which is why they use 1 or 2 examples to say, oh, Sirhan wasn't interested in politics. He wanted to be a jockey. He's interested in making money. And so they go on about that, but they just omit the volumes of information in which Sirhan was a virulent, anti-Semitic, Palestinian nationalistic fanatic. And it's all there. And I've dug up, like, with more research into that particular part of Sirhan's personality, which is a motive for his crime. A lot of your listeners will never have heard of how Al-Fatah, which was the precursor of the PLO and the terrorist group, how they were active in the United States in 1968, giving speeches and promoting their hatred of Jews.
Incredible. We were talking earlier, speaking of...
I'd like to say as well,
Yeah,
sorry, Laurie, I'd like to say that, people might say, because I'm saying this, oh, well, Mel Ayton must be Jewish, and indeed. Look, I'm a Catholic Christian, all right? So, I'm not, I'm not taking that side for that reason or anything like that. I am pro-Israel. Yes, of course I am. I believe that, that the Christian connection with the Jewish faith, and so fully supportive. But that doesn't mean to say I'm an apologist.
I get that one all the time myself, Mel, especially since October 7th. Everyone seems to assume that I'm Jewish. I must get asked 50 times a day, "Are you a Jew?" Like, no, I'm
Yeah.
just an ordinary Christian. I'm definitely not Jewish. We were talking earlier about Sirhan's friend, MT Mehdi, an early activist for the Palestinian cause, and a longtime friend of Sirhan. Sirhan,
And a pro-violent fermenter, actually, with his speeches in the United States at the time.
you mean before the shooting?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Sirhan once told Mehdi that he was obsessed with the matter of the Palestinian people's rights, the cause. And I'm going to read you a quote here. Sirhan told him, quote, "I don't think I'll ever settle or rest or have my inner feelings of peace as long as my own countrymen are being deprived." Those words chill me to my core now when I see the current war in Gaza, and I wonder how Sirhan is dealing with this current war in the Middle East. Of course, no one knows, or if they do know, no one is talking. Sirhan will be up for parole again next year in 2025. Do you believe, Mel, even at age 81, that Sirhan's release would further inflame the Arab world? And if he is deported back to Palestine, which I assume he will be because he's not a U.S. citizen, would he receive a hero's welcome there?
Of course he would. Yes. I mean, there'd be days and weeks of celebrations. Who knows what that might spark off if Sirhan was released. Look, a long time ago, it was possible a long time ago that he could have had parole. He's had been badly advised, just like James L. Ray was actually. He's been badly advised by his lawyers and by his defenders. He's been badly advised because of the stories about being a hypnotized assassin working for the CIA and all of that. And he's just taking the wrong path, the wrong route. I mean, it's his own fault, really. But getting released, definitely not. Well, the Israelis wouldn't accept him to begin with. Um, how they're going to handle it, who knows? If he gets parole, but look. My position is this: I'm not against him being paroled if he, he just tells the truth, which he should have done from the beginning instead of holding on to these this mumbo jumbo nonsensical conspiracy tales. What I wouldn't. I agree with the Israelis. You shouldn't go back to settle in the West Bank. But about him staying in California, I don't know. That's up to the Californian government. But he'd have to have some, it'd have to be some control. We don't want him writing books and making money out of his lies. That's for sure. And judges can do that, as you know. Courts can say, you can't benefit from your crime.
He has said many times through the years that he wants to get out of the United States. He hates this place. When he gets parole, he wants to go back to Palestine because he does expect to get a hero's welcome there and probably would
Yeah.
find lots of
But
riches there.
yeah, he changes tack though with his stories. I mean, he's forever changing his stories, as you can see from all of the parole files that are on record now, and you can see how he wants to, well, appealing for sympathy, which I suppose all parolees do. He wants to go back to his house in Pasadena to look after his ailing brother. So, that's one of his reasons for wanting release.
Right. I know his brother
But
wants him home with him and needs him because he's, I guess, mostly blind now, getting on in years.
yeah, yeah, uh, being a threat to the United States, no, I don't take a harsh view of that. He is coming up to 81 next March, so But look, it's different from an ordinary murder, as you know, and as Bobby Kennedy's children have said too. You know, it was not just an attack on their father; it was an attack on the United States, really.
Well, and also, we have seen how this family's been re-traumatized over and over the past 56 years by Palestinian terrorist groups who were inspired by Sirhan's quote heroic act. And in fact, they literally took one of Bobby's sons as a hostage during a hijacking incident. He's lucky he lived through this whole thing. And speaking of Bobby's sons, I expressed to you in our previous interview my concerns over Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s safety, as he is now out on the campaign trail running for president, just like his dad, in full throated support of Israel without Secret Service protection. And this has brought about many death threats from pro Hamas fanatics who wish him harm. It's an
I think it's
it's an extremely dangerous environment for him to be out campaigning in, given this history. Am I wrong? Do you think that Kennedy's in danger?
Of course. It really is. It's shameful of President Biden. It's in their power to do this. He's an obvious target. Even though he's an independent candidate, he's still an obvious target. They've done it before. They did it for Ted Kennedy. They did it for Barack Obama. So, it can be done, and it should be done.
I hope it will be done as early as next week. The way the law is written, technically and legally, the presidential candidates are entitled to Secret Service protection 120 days out from the election. And that deadline's coming right up. It would be July the 7th. So on that date, Bobby would be legally and officially eligible for that Secret Service protection.
One of the stipulations is, the polling. Bobby Kennedy is doing well in the polls.
I wanted to ask you about that because you've actually written books about the Secret Service and protection of presidents and presidential candidates. So you're kind of expert on that. Any thoughts on, what if they actually denied him, even if he's within that 120-day window? Do you think they'll find some other reason to deny him Secret Service protection?
I think there'll be sort of an outcry in the American press, really. There's no reason why they shouldn't.
No. They should have given it to him a year ago, it seems to me. It seems to me anyone with the last name of Kennedy who's running for president should just automatically get Secret Service protection.
Yeah, well, they made exceptions. They made exceptions with Ted Kennedy.
Right.
And they made, on more than one occasion, actually. People think it was just because, he's running against Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. No, he was given, Nixon gave him presidential protection.
That's correct. Yes, in like 1972.
Yeah. I'll add a little bit of cynicism to that, actually, Laurie, because Nixon had a Secret Service plant on his team.
That's right. And we found that out when the Nixon tapes were finally released. There's a tape of him saying, get me my mole inside the Secret Service to spy on Teddy Kennedy and get information about his sexual escapades.
Well, also the plumbers are involved in that. They sent a guy to Chappaquiddick to see if they could dig up any dirt on Ted.
That's right. Wasn't it Howard Hunt?
Ulowich, I think it was, the New York detective who was hired by the plumbers. But yeah, it was Hunt who's, obviously the main guy with Charles Colson.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, yeah. But getting back to Bobby Kennedy, well, of course, I think most Americans would say, look, isn't this reasonable? A reasonable request, of course.
And I know that you, of course, disagree with Bobby's conclusions on or his revised conclusions on the murder of his dad. He went for more than 50 years of his life believing that Sirhan was guilty as sin. Then he, fell under the influence of Paul Schrade, of Lisa Pease, of Sirhan's defense lawyers, and Sirhan himself, whom he visited in prison in 2017. And of course, Bobby Kennedy Jr. later advocated for Sirhan's parole, which, honestly seems kind of crazy to me and probably to you too.
Look, I'm not anti Bobby Kennedy, of course not. In fact, as a student, I was a big supporter of his father. Real big supporter, actually. I wanted to see Bobby Kennedy president. Even though I'm British, obviously I still had an interest, a passion in American history at that time. So, yeah, he's an intelligent guy. I mean, I loved his book Framed, his book defending his cousin. He's an excellent writer. He's an intelligent guy, and but clearly we differ when it comes to these conclusions about his father's death.
Right. And, we can, even smart people like Bobby and me, we can be hoodwinked. And I think that he got hoodwinked by Sirhan and Sirhan's crafty lawyers who cooked up this whole Manchurian candidate theory to get their client off the hook. Unfortunately, Bobby fell for it. And here's why I think he did. And I want to see if you agree with me. I think that there are two sides to Sirhan Sirhan. He can, at times, by all accounts, be very polite, very rational, very soft-spoken, obviously very intelligent, and even kind, according to many people who've known him. The only time that he flies into a rage is whenever the Israel-Palestine subject comes up. And then he just explodes.
Laurie. Yep. Absolutely correct.
And I have a sense that when Bobby Kennedy Jr. met him in prison, Sirhan was on his best behavior. And the topic of Israel probably didn't even come up in that conversation. Supposedly they met for 3 hours, so they had a good long talk. If it had come up, I think that Bobby would have seen a completely different side of Sirhan Sirhan.
I would have seen his course. The guy who really got into Sirhan's mind with his interviews, 3 interviews, was Dan Muldoon. Mm-hmm. He saw right through him. And he saw how he still was, very manipulative. And, every time that Dan brought up, means, motive, and opportunity, he would have an alternative answer. Yeah.
And, Dan, of course, Dan wasn't really focused on the Israel-Palestine angle, the political motives that Sirhan had. Dan's more of a true crime writer. He was trying to nail him on motive, means, and opportunity, which he did.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
when it came to the motive, of course, I mean, that's obviously where I came in, and really most of my work was about looking at the conspiracy theories and getting to the core of Sirhan's motive.
Which is everything, in my opinion, in this case. And it's amazing to me that, in 56 years, most of the authors and historians who've tackled this case, including me, I'm as guilty of it as everybody else until recently, totally overlooked the most important part of the story, which is motive. And so I wonder, Mel, if Bobby Kennedy Jr. were to visit Sirhan again in prison today, right now, while a war rages in the Middle East, while Bobby himself is running for president, like his father, and were to ask him one question: how do you feel about the war in Gaza? Do you think that Sirhan would be able to contain his rage? And would this cause RFK Jr. to change his mind about Sirhan Sirhan not being a threat to society, and in fact, Sirhan being a threat to himself, Bobby's wife, his kids, and the rest of the Kennedy family?
No, because I think Sirhan is far too cunning, uh, to make that mistake. Um, the way his mind is, as you said, he's intelligent. He used to have a big chip on his shoulder when he was a young man, before the assassination, and because he believed. I mean, he flunked out of Pasadena College, but he really had this. I guess it's a kind of narcissistic type of way of thinking, that he believed he was more intelligent than anyone else. Um, was he? Well, not really, but he certainly had cunning intelligence, you know, uh, yeah, for sure.
I wonder. I wonder. It seems like when it comes to the Israel Palestine thing, of all of the transcripts I've read from his parole hearings over the years, even as he gets old, that, even at the most recent one, which I think was 2023, the subject came up. He was asked, "How do you feel about, what's going on over there in the Middle East?" And that's when Sirhan started to blow up. He just could not contain himself when it comes to that. And when he sees Gaza, these airstrikes in Gaza, and surely he gets the news while he's in prison. I don't know if he has internet access or how he gets his news, but he's seen pictures of what Gaza looks like right now, and how it's just been flattened. I can only imagine how that must make Sirhan feel. It must bring out all that rage.
He said this a few times. Words to the effect, I can't remember the exact phrase, but he says, one time when he had an outburst, he said, I'm not psycho unless it comes to the Middle East. So there you go, from his own.
He told the truth that time.
Yeah, yeah.
Occasionally the
Yeah,
truth slips out.
yeah, yeah. But it's a fascinating story about how he's gone through the last 50 years, bobbing and weaving. You know, his defenders, allowing his defenders to help him, and changing his story, and thinking about the parole board. Oh my God, I've got to show some remorse. And how do I do that while saying I'm still innocent? It's a fascinating story.
It
Um,
is. And it's fascinating when I look at the transcripts from his parole hearings. And I guess they no longer do video of those, but there are some, they used to record those
few clips.
hearings.
They let news organizations in now and again, just to film some of these hearings, recently, over the last 10 years or so. Um, yes, it's fascinating to uh, I, his. I remember seeing one clip, and it was William Pepper, defending him, and I thought, my God, you're just going to keep this guy in prison, because he just, all of these made up stories about hypnotized assassin and things of that nature. Look, he hypnotized himself. He was a member of the Rosicrucians, which were into, hypnosis, self-help, and he was doing all of that. And to say it was a CIA agent, I mean, it's just made up stories, really. I think the majority of American people are more rational, more intelligent than that to be taken in. But as we talked about before, Laurie, it really is a money making business.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And, before we wrap up, I do want to address the MK Ultra theory that he was somehow mind controlled. And I tend to agree with you that Sirhan was skilled at self hypnosis. He said himself that he used to hypnotize himself in the mirror shortly before the assassination. I think by candlelight, and he would stare at his own face in the mirror while he's thinking about Robert Kennedy and how angry he was. at Robert Kennedy, and he would see Robert Kennedy's face staring back at him in the mirror and things of that nature. So I think
nice dramatic, but it's from Sirhan's mouth.
yeah, he said that himself.
But look, the whole sort of hypnotized CIA assassin story is there in the book, The Forgotten Terrorist. I'll try to be brief to explain to your listeners how it came about. The Americans only start to look into this, the MK Ultra, because the Russians were doing it. The KGB was doing it, GRU, and what happened was that the Russians never came out with a hypnotized assassin. The Americans tried, they didn't. And I'm being very brief here because it's a very complex story. Did you know that the Israelis tried?
They did. They did. I think it was in 1968.
It was indeed, and they wanted to kill Yasser Arafat.
That's right.
So they hired a Palestinian, sent him across to Amman, across the border to Jordan. And when he got there, he told Arafat exactly what the Israelis had been doing. So, total failure, and they didn't try it again. That's in an excellent book, Ron Bergman's Rise and Kill First. An excellent book. That story, Ron Bergman, an expert on the IDF and the Israeli intelligence services. Brilliant book. So I recommend that one, Rise and Kill First. And that story is in there about how they tried to get a hypnotized assassin to bomb off Arafat. So there you go.
It's fascinating stuff. It really is.
And face it, if Mossad couldn't do it, the CIA as well. They admitted. I think it was Moore Salin. I think was the one of the guys heavily involved in that. And, he did sort of admit, well, we tried, but no, can't do it. And then the conspiracy writers talk about how Derren Brown. He's a famous illusionist in the UK. And how he hypnotized this guy to shoot somebody, right? Then they all jumped on the bandwagon. Look, proof that you can build a hypnotized assassin. What they didn't quote was Derren Brown's explanation. He didn't exactly tell people how he did it. He's an illusionist. He makes money out of it. And that's exactly what he said. He says, look, the idea is for people to work it out. Meaning, it wasn't magic and it wasn't getting somebody to kill somebody. He did it through the powers that he had. He's a brilliant illusionist, of course. So they don't mention that one. In fact, they've now abandoned that story because obviously I exposed it by quoting Derren Brown. And they rely on another one now, which goes back to, I don't know, somewhere like Yugoslavia back 100 years ago. So, it'd be hard to verify that one.
The CIA, I've looked into MK Ultra quite a bit, and especially the programmed assassin stuff.
Great letter that they put press release because they don't usually comment about things like that. And they've I've got the letter here. I've got a copy of the letter. It's the press release, and no, of course not. I mean, it's absurd. Anyway, sorry for interrupting, Laurie.
That's okay. I was just going to bring up William Jennings Bryan, who was one of their CIA shrinks, psychiatrists, brainwashers who. He was quite a character, this guy. And, he loved to get together with some ladies of the evening and drink heavily. And they were probably doing some drugs. And, he would brag.
Just a debauched, idiot, really. They hung on to that story for years and years. It doesn't appear. It hasn't. Not that I can say. I've read all the conspiracy books about the Robert Kennedy assassination. It doesn't seem to have
Well, they spend a lot of
Great,
time on that guy,
great.
William Jennings Bryan, and they say, they love to
Hey,
tell the story of how one night he was with some ladies of
yeah,
the evening and bragged that he was the one who programmed Sirhan Sirhan to kill Robert Kennedy. He also claimed to have programmed, what's his name, Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler.
yeah, yeah. That's right. Um, no, his whole life is. I mentioned it in mention him, and how it's just been debunked. It's like all of the other ones in the Forgotten Terrorist. I look at another one was Jerry Owen. Um, so there's so many of them came out the woodwork for whatever reason, uh, attention seeking, publicity, and all that. So many made up stories. Uh, there was one, a recent book. That's right, an incredible story about how these two, Brad Johnson and Tim Tate, in their book, in 2018 book, they thought they'd found the polka dot woman, right? And how her relatives have said that she used to get this dress out the attic every now and again and look at it and cry or whatever. Um, it's just, she was obviously a psychiatric patient as well. So they just, they grab at anything to, you know, just build intrigue and drama. And there's no real evidence. There's no evidence at all, actually. Uh, so each one they bring up, it's like whack-a-mole, plain whack-a-mole. Each one that you know, they find out that one of their theories is debunked, they'll choose another one, and then another one when that's debunked. It keeps going on and on.
It never
But
ends. It never
it's
ends.
never because there's money to be made.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, Mel,
yeah.
I started on this journey of producing this podcast series back in January. So it's been going on 7 months now. This is our 11th episode. And I feel like after 35 years of researching this case and changing my mind twice, um, and changing it back to my original belief that Sirhan was guilty. And I feel now that after taking a deep dive through all of the evidence, at least all the publicly available evidence, that's everything. I think everything is public now. As far as I know, they're not withholding any files. As far as you know, are they still withholding any files in the RFK case? We know the government's withholding some JFK files, but all of the RFK files are public now. Is that right?
Yes,
I thought so.
yes. Yeah, easily accessible. Um, but when my when look when the next book comes, when the making of an assassin is published late this year, early next year, I'm confident that most people, when they take the whole story together, and I do advise that people read Dan Mulder's book really, because that's really solving the case itself in terms of the shooting. Um, so if they read Dan Mulder's book, The Forgotten Terrorist, perhaps, but if they, I think the clincher, I'm confident the clincher will be if they read The Making of an Assassin, because really that's going to the heart of the motive, showing how Sirhan has lied, lie after lie, and that the real truth is in the people who knew him, the people who knew him well, including members of his family who told stories about Sirhan's reaction to certain events, especially in the Middle East. Friends, I've uncovered transcripts of interviews by the LAPD, Special Unit Senator detectives, which just reveal more. So I'm confident that this should settle the case, taken together with Dan Mulder's excellent work, of course. Your listeners must examine Dan's book, I think that's probably one of the reasons as well. I think a lot of journalists and people who believe in conspiracy just haven't just haven't read Dan's book.
Yes, and this is he's the last interview I'd like to get in this series, because his book is so important, because he's the only one who really knew Thane Eugene Caesar, who had Caesar's power of attorney. And I feel like Dan would complete the series. That would be the last episode. This may be the last
Right.
episode if Dan says no. When I,
Oh, sorry, Laurie. Can I just add
oh,
one more
sure,
thing
of course.
before I forget? And you just reminded me when you mentioned Gene Caesar. One of the the what conspiracists use is the fact that Gene Caesar definitely did have a 2.2 pistol, right? Not on him that night. His gun was checked, and no, he didn't. But he had a 2.2 pistol, so yes, that's the one who shot Bobby Kennedy in the back of the head while Sirhan was shooting blanks. Would you believe it, from the front? Which one, conspiracy writer?
That's the
Right.
wildest story I've ever heard.
He sold the gun. Yes, of course it is. He sold the gun in September. Now look, we've got June, the assassination, June 4th, 5th, early morning, 12:15 a.m., June 5th. You've got June, July, August, September. So you've got at least 3 months that he's holding onto the murder weapon. What killer would do that? It's ridiculous. And he sold it
Exactly.
instead of throwing it in the room. So you've really got to do somersaults with logic, to believe that nonsense.
Well, Dan Moldia has been invited to do an interview with me. I'd love to give him the closing argument, as the prosecuting attorney, if you will, in this series. Since this is more like a pseudo trial, I guess, of Sirhan Sirhan. In this series, I have really tried to be completely fair, and I've interviewed, historians and experts and authors from both sides. I've talked to Lisa Pease, who wrote the book A Lie Too Big to Fail. I've spoken to James D'Eugenio, who co-authored the book The Assassinations. They both argue that Sirhan could not have killed Senator Kennedy, and I've given them both, at least 2 or 3 hours apiece to make their argument as well. And I've tried to balance this out so that we hear from both sides, for the prosecution and the defense, and let the listeners decide, because you, the people, are the jury in this case, as I so often say. Bobby Kennedy is trying to do the same thing that Paul Schrade wanted all those years, and that's to get a new investigation, to reinvestigate the evidence that we have using 21st century technology. I'm all for it. If we can get something new, maybe we'll learn something new from it. Maybe the case is too cold after all these years. What do you think, Mel?
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention, you mentioned Lisa Pease's book. If your listeners are interested, they can easily read a review of her book that I wrote for Max Holland's Washington Decoded. All they've got to do is Google that name. And really, your listeners can make their own mind up about the things that she's coming out with, which I disapprove.
I've read that piece, and it was actually an excellent debunking of her book. My major beef with Lisa Pease's research, of course, I completely discount the blanks theory. I don't know how the heck she came up with that one, but my main beef with her work.
I do. Yes, she found one witness statement in the Bobby Kennedy assassination LAPD files, and the one witness statement was along the lines of, I can't remember the exact words, but along the lines of, and then it seemed to be that the paper was in the air. So she goes into detail about how, blanks, when you shoot blanks, often, some makes would have little pieces of paper flowing around. So yeah, that was the origins of that one.
Ah, I see. Well, I think my main beef with her work is that obviously she's biased. I mean, she literally spearheads the Free Sirhan movement. She works directly with Sirhan and his defense lawyers, and her goal, her stated goal, which she makes no secret of, is that she wants to get Sirhan out of prison and clear his good name. And to me, that's just obviously that's a biased viewpoint, and there's no way that she could possibly, evaluate the evidence objectively and fairly. And if since October 7th, this is an interesting part of the story. She and Robert Kennedy Jr. got to be good friends over the past several years. I think she was the one who got him into the prison to visit Sirhan back in 2017. She arranged that, of course, because she was close to his defense team. And also, she was the one who was advising him to go after Thane Eugene Caesar. And on the day that Thane Eugene Caesar died, in my interview with Lisa Pease, she showed me a photograph of her and Bobby Kennedy standing at Bobby Kennedy's kitchen. Bobby Kennedy Jr. called her on the day that Caesar died and said, "You've got to get over to my house. I want to put out a statement saying this guy killed my father or something. And I need your help because you're the expert. I don't really know what to say. Lisa, come over and help me figure out what to say." And then she helped him write that Instagram post that he put out on the day that Thane Caesar died, accusing this man of being his father's real killer. And since the war in Gaza started on October 7th, Lisa Pease terminated her friendship with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They had a pretty nasty parting of the ways because he is so pro-Israel, because she is vehemently pro-Palestine. If you go read her Twitter feed, you'll see that she is staunchly anti-Zionist and very pro-Palestine. So again, her politics interferes with her work. And as a journalist who believes in fairness and objectivity, and as a historian who believes in, evaluating the facts dispassionately, I find that to be problematic.
Well, she was a real expert. She was a real expert at disinformation, that's for sure.
And yet, to this day, I just recently saw an interview with Bobby Kennedy where he was out there recommending her book and saying it's the best book ever written about his father's murder. And I was sitting there thinking, she hates you, right?
It's very hard to... It looked... Goodness me. I mean, it's to me, it's QAnon type idiocy that's rampant in the United States today. Terrible. But I'm still confident that the vast majority of Americans, goodness me, there's 330 million of you, are just great people, I've always loved America. Great people, intelligent people, the vast majority. But of course, you've got groups of idiots in all countries, haven't you?
It's so true. Well, I hope next time you're here in the United States or next time I make it over to the UK that we can finally meet face to face, because I really had it's such a pleasure meeting you.
Well, we'll keep
virtually.
in touch.
Most definitely. And before we go, I'd like to recommend everyone pick up his book, The Forgotten Terrorist, Sirhan Sirhan and the Assassination of Robert Kennedy. It's a great read. And you were kind enough to share with me an advance copy of your manuscript for your new book on Sirhan. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, Mel, this new book is so much better than The Forgotten Terrorist. I really, really love this new book, and I can't wait for everyone else to read it. I think if anyone could convince the sensible people out there in America and around the world that Sirhan Sirhan is right where he belongs, he's in prison for life and that's where he should stay, and that he's a guilty man, I think that you've made the ultimate case. No disrespect intended to Dan Moldea, but I think that the motive is everything in this case. And it's the big mistake that every researcher over the last 56 years, except you, has made, including me. I overlooked it stupidly. And it wasn't until, honestly, the war in Gaza and what happened after October 7th and this rise in pro Hamas sentiment, the uh, anti Zionism, the anti Semitism in the air, it all just kind of clicked for me at the same time that I was going through the Sirhan files and producing this series. And it all came together. And for the first time in my life, I understood what made Sirhan tick, and it all just made sense to me now. So thank you for the wisdom that you've given me through your books, through the generosity of your time, through sharing your manuscript with me. And where can people find you and support you and follow you, Mel?
Well, I do have a website, melayton.com. But I want to thank you for those kind comments. I really do. I really appreciate it. And I want to tell you listeners too that, when I came across your series on the assassination, I thought my first thoughts were what a breath of fresh air to common sense and media intelligence in the United States. And so I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I am deeply touched and honored. Thank you for listening, everyone. And I think this will probably be our final episode unless I can get Dan Moldia on the show. Dan Moldia says he doesn't want to talk to me until after the election because he has challenged Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to a debate on this very topic. Those two have been going at it back and forth on this subject for years. Of course, Bobby Kennedy believes that Thane Eugene Caesar was his father's real killer, although there is something that I want to remind people because this is often misunderstood. A lot of people say that Bobby Kennedy believes Sirhan Sirhan is innocent. He does not believe that. What Bobby Kennedy Jr. has said is that Sirhan was definitely involved. That's a quote. He says he was definitely involved in the murder of his father. He just believes that he was in cahoots with somebody else, Thane Eugene Caesar, I guess. But Dan Moldy obviously disputes that. He says Caesar is an innocent man, or was an innocent man. He's now deceased, falsely accused. And so he wants to go mano a mano and have this debate with Bobby Kennedy Jr., which I think would just be delicious. And I would love to see that happen. It probably won't happen until after the election, I would think. I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. is just focusing right now on his presidential campaign and getting ballot access across America and winning in November. But after the election, you never know. And I hope that that meeting between those two happens. And I hope that after the election, Dan Moldia might sit down and give me a couple of hours of his time because boy, would I like to pick his brain. I've got a lot of questions. Uh, but if he does, then we will update the series and we'll do episode 12 with Dan Moldia. But I feel like, and Mel, you've probably listened to all the episodes. Do you think I've pretty well covered the case? Have I talked to every living person, every living expert who's still around to educate me on this topic?
I think so, but if I come across any of the witnesses who are still alive, I'll certainly tip you off about
Oh, I'd
it
love to talk to them.
because we discussed this before. Walter Crowe. Oh, I'd love to talk to him, but I don't even know if he's alive. I tried to find out. Because obviously the first place you start is California. Um, it'd be fascinating to talk to Walter Crowe. He's already provided such an awful lot of thing in transcripts that I've found in the LAPD files, but he may be able to provide more if he's still alive. Yeah.
And for those
And
listening who don't know who Walter Crowe is, tell our listeners a little bit about him because he's a fascinating character and someone who originally the police thought might be a co-conspirator with Sirhan.
That's right. Um, I've really, sort of concluded that no, I mean, he wasn't a conspirator. He was very close to Sirhan. He's rarely mentioned in any of the books about the conspiracy, but he is very close, and he politically knew an awful lot about Sirhan's politics and Sirhan's fanaticism, an awful lot. Comes across as a very sincere guy in the transcripts. So yeah, very important person. So I write about Walter Crowe in my next book. But one thing I'd like to say, I'd also would love to see Dan Muldaur and Bobby Kennedy Jr. Debate. I think it would be very, very useful, and I think it would just be, because there will be a large audience, and will explain to people who have still have lots of questions about the case, and I think Dan will be able to do that. He's an excellent debater. So
And so is
yeah,
Bobby Kennedy.
and
That
so
would be
Bobby
something
Kennedy
else.
as well. Bobby Kennedy, very intelligent, of course, yeah. But I'm kind of biased towards Dan, though.
Well, I kind of, on this particular case, I'm a big supporter of Bobby Kennedy. I'm a volunteer on his campaign. I want him to win the election.
Yep.
But on this one, I have to say that Dan Muldaur got it right, in my opinion. And if anyone could change Bobby Kennedy's mind, maybe it would be Dan Muldaur, although I understand they're kind of on the outs. I don't think they've been on speaking terms for a few years because, Dan was the middleman. Bobby Kennedy Jr. was trying to set up a meeting with Thane Eugene Caesar back in 2018, 2019.
That's right.
I guess Bobby Kennedy Jr. had a documentary film in mind, and he had a film crew. He had reached out to Dan because Dan was like the only person who knows Thane Eugene Caesar's phone number, knows his location, and had his power of attorney. And so anybody who wanted to speak to Caesar had to go through Dan Muldaur. Bobby reached out to Dan Muldaur, and they started negotiations for this proposed documentary film. And Dan Muldaur, on behalf of Gene Caesar, who was negotiating on his behalf. Let me make sure I have my story straight. You correct me if I'm wrong. Caesar had asked for an honorarium of $10,000 to speak to Bobby and to do this film on camera. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. agreed, which is kind of wild to me that you would actually pay $10,000 to talk to the man that you think murdered your dad, but he was willing to pay it. And then they tell two different stories here. Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s version of events was that after he agreed to the 10 grand, then Caesar came back with a counter offer asking for 20 grand and then 25 grand. The price just kept going up until Bobby Kennedy Jr. says Caesar was, quote, playing him. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. claims he dropped out of negotiations. But there's a different story that's told by Dan Muldaur. He says that the $20,000 and $25,000 offer did not come from his client, from Gene Caesar, that it was actually the film's producers who came back with that counteroffer of $20,000 because Gene was getting cold feet. Gene and Dan Muldaur felt that they were being lured into a trap, that Bobby Kennedy Jr. and his film crew were going to come down there to the Philippines and literally have him arrested and maybe extradite him back to the United States and put Gene Caesar on trial for murder, which was not an unreasonable concern, really. If I were Gene Caesar, I'd be pretty nervous about that too. He knew that Bobby Kennedy Jr. is obviously a great lawyer, not a prosecutor, but he certainly knows a lot of prosecutors. So I don't know if it was a trap or not. But at that point, Gene Caesar and Dan Muldaur turned down this offer. They said, we don't want any part of this. We don't think you're going to treat Gene Caesar fairly. We think this is a trap. And that's when the film crew, the producers of that documentary, came back to Gene Caesar with a sweeter offer, and that they offered the $20,000 to try and change his mind. But it didn't work. Gene Caesar and Dan Muldaur ultimately said no, and that's where the negotiations ended. I don't think that Dan Muldaur and Bobby Kennedy have spoken to each other since then. And then, of course, as we know, Gene Caesar passed away in 2019. So unfortunately, that meeting will never come to be. And the closest that Bobby Kennedy Jr. will ever get to Thane Eugene Caesar is to speak to Dan Moldea.
That's right. And as you know, it's that story is pretty complex. I don't want to do it injustice by sort of mangling it myself because it was Dan who's obviously the expert in that area. What I can suggest to your listeners is that Dan has put the whole story. You've just repeated quite a lot of it there, Laurie. He's put the whole story out on mobology. Dan Mulder mobology. It's a kind of look. I'm not sort of clued in with social media and all of that.
I think that's his Substack. But, that's Dan Muldea's Substack.
Substack. Okay. Mm-hmm. So he's put that story in. So any of your listeners can search that to read it, to read about that story. Yeah.
And I'll put a link to that article underneath this post so that people who are curious can go look it up. It's a whale of a story. Wow.
Yeah, it is.
It really is.
Very complex. But no, look, Dan Mulder and Bobby Kennedy Jr. debating. Wow, I think that would be. I think it would attract an awful lot of viewers for that one.
I wonder if we'd get 5.5 million like we did on the presidential debate, the real debate that we did the other night.
That was brilliant. Yeah, it really was. I mean, yeah, astounding. I just watched the the Trump Biden debate because I recorded it and then watched it the next day.
What did you think? I'm curious.
Look, I've recorded and watched all of the debates ever since the recorders came out back in the 70s. So I've watched all of the president, and I started my first presidential debate. I watched actually was my first presidential election that I watched. From day to day and week to week was the 1968 presidential election. But when the debates came out, there wasn't a debate for the 68 election. I don't think Nixon refused to do it. So the next debate would be Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, I think, with 76.
That's correct.
And so since then, I've recorded them and watched them the next day. And rather than listen to the media, make my own mind up. Well, I didn't have a chance to do that with Trump and Biden. And so, because I turned the radio on, I heard all of these comments. But wow, what a debate! I mean, goodness me, Bobby Kennedy should have been the third one in the debate, I think.
It was disgraceful the way that CNN kept changing the rules and rigging the rules to exclude him. They disqualified one of their own polls. They wanted him to have 15%, a certain number of polls, and the Monmouth University poll was one of the polls they listed as acceptable, and he was polling at like 17 or 18% in that one, clearly qualified. And then they said, we're not going to accept that poll, and said that he had to be on enough ballots to get him 270 electoral votes, which is impossible this early in the campaign season, especially for an independent candidate, because it takes time. He's submitted enough ballot access petitions in many states to qualify easily for 270 electoral votes, but it takes time for the states to verify all the signatures and to actually certify that he's on the ballot, which is a process that usually doesn't complete until August. So that, in the past, always, this is the first time in history that we've ever had presidential debates in June. Historically, we always had them in September and October.
That's right.
And we did that for a reason, because it was after the two big party conventions in July and August. And we had to give the parties time to choose their nominee. So even Trump and Biden didn't technically qualify for, 270 electoral votes because they're not legally the nominees of their party yet. It was just insane.
That's correct. That's a good argument. Yeah, of course.
So did you get to see the real debate, the sort of alternate debate that Bobby Kennedy did, where he responded to the questions in real time with a 2-minute limit? Did you get to see that?
I have been very busy this last week.
Okay.
Sorry to say I haven't watched it yet, but of course I've got it I got it clicked for one of my favorites to watch. Yeah.
And you can watch it right here on X. You just go to at Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Robert Kennedy Jr. is his handle, and it's right there on his page. Last time I looked, it had something like 12 million views. While it was live, we had topped out at 5.5 million views, which is pretty amazing.
It is amazing.
It
yeah.
is.
Third party.
So he's doing something historic here. Whether or not he can win in November remains to be seen. A lot can happen in the next 4.5 months. And my biggest question is, will Biden make it to the finish line?
Well, big question. I wouldn't want to venture, sort of I'm no political prophet, so I wouldn't want to venture what would happen. But let's see.
Well, it's all pretty exciting. And I hope that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s presidential run has a happier ending than his father's did. And the happiest ending of all that I could think of would to see him take the oath of office next January. And people say it can't be done, but I say never say never. So well, with that being said, Mel, I want to thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you for doing this second interview with me, and I hope that we'll do many more in the future. And when your book comes out, I certainly want to talk to you again at that time for sure.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Laurie. And well, let's keep watching the election. And yeah, it's still going to be a fascinating election. They're always exciting, the American ones.
I can only imagine what it's like being a Brit watching our crazy American politics.
Well, we are also in the middle of an election here. In fact, the ballots are on Thursday. So, yeah, we've also probably got a lot of disillusioned voters in this country, too.
Well, British politics is pretty crazy, too. I always enjoy watching your House of Commons debates. Those are the best.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've been to the Senate, as you know, and the House of Representatives a few times, and yeah, it's not like that, is it? I think you Americans are more civilized with your.
Are we? That's
right.
News to me.
Take care.
Thank you, Mel, and thanks everybody for listening. I think this is the end of the podcast series, but stay tuned. We just might have some surprises down the road for you. I'm Laurie Spencer. Thanks so much for listening. Good night, everybody.